If you ever thought that money, status, or education could make you immune to discrimination, then this story will make you think again. Before we begin, if you're listening to this story and it resonates with a memory of your own, please hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Not just to support the channel, but to remind yourself that stories like this need to be told and need to be heard. That night, John F. Kennedy International Airport Terminal 4, New York. It was late autumn. The wind was just cold enough to make one pull up their collar. The familiar sounds of the airport echoed like an endless soundtrack, suitcase wheels rolling on the stone pavement, flight announcements blaring over the loudspeakers, and lives passing each other without ever meeting. In a secluded corner of the first-class lounge, away from the bar and the noisy crowd, two black men sat quietly. No flashiness, no logos, no attempt to prove anything. Their names are Marcus Reed and Malcolm Reed, twin brothers, 42 years old, CEO and co-founder of Reed Logistics Group, a logistics conglomerate holding strategic stakes in several major airports in Europe and North America. But nobody in that waiting room knew this. At most glance, they'd just be two black men in dark hoodies and neat jeans sitting silently drinking water. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, closing his eyes. For the past 3 days, he had slept less than 10 hours. A merger in Chicago just closed in the early morning. They saved over 600 jobs. No news. No grand announcement. Malcolm glanced at his watch. Gate boarding in 15 minutes. Marcus nodded. Which chair? 1A and 1B. Bulkhead. Marcus chuckled softly. Finally, I can stretch my legs. Neither of them spoke further. There was always a very special kind of silence between them. The silence of people who had been through too much, who had learned that it wasn't always necessary to speak up. When boarding first class was called, they stood up. No one noticed. No one said hello, except for Ethan, the young check-in employee. The scanner beeps. Welcome aboard, Mr. Reed. Then came the second turn. Enjoy your flight, Mr. Reed. That's all. Marcus and Malcolm stepped onto the airplane's jet bridge. The first-class cabin was quiet, luxurious to the point of being almost cold. Cream-colored leather, walnut wood, soft yellow lighting. They put away their bags and sat down in their assigned seats. Marcus by the window, Malcolm by the aisle. A flight attendant approached. Lauren, blonde hair, standard smile, champagne gentleman. Just water, Marcus Dapp, sparkling if possible. Lauren nodded and turned away. A few minutes later, more passengers began to board. A chief technology officer, an elderly couple, familiar faces of the service class. And then, she appeared. Evelyn Crawford, around 50 years old. A beige cashmere coat. A bright red leather handbag, the kind whose price you can tell just by looking at the logo. She stopped abruptly right at the entrance to the first-class cabin. His gaze swept across each row of seats. Then it stopped at Marcus and Malcolm. 1 beat. 2 beats. Her face contorted in a grimace. She hurried down the aisle, her heels clicking loudly on the carpet. Stop right next to Malcolm. Excuse me, she said loudly. You're sitting in the wrong place. Malcolm opened his eyes. Calm down. I don't think so, ma'am. This seat is mine, she said, her voice sharp as a knife. We always sit in the front row. Marcus turned around. Maybe the company has different arrangements today. Evelyn looked straight at him. Her eyes were cold. Impossible, she lowered her voice. But everyone in the cabin could hear her. Clearly there's a misunderstanding. These seats aren't for you guys. The air is freezing. Malcolm sat up straight. Ma'am, he said slowly, we've bought tickets. Seats 1A and 1B. Evelyn smirked. An upgrade or an employee ticket? Marcus didn't answer. He just looked at her silently. Lauren turned around and saw the scene. What's wrong, Mrs. Crawford? Yes, Evelyn said, pointing. These two are sitting in my seat. Lauren looked at Marcus and Malcolm. Then she looked at Evelyn. And at that moment, a wrong decision began to take shape. Marcus saw that. He had seen that look too many times in his life. The look of someone wondering, who will be a bigger problem if I don't please them? Lauren turned to face them. Gentlemen, may I see your boarding passes again? Marcus wasn't in a hurry. We gave it to them when boarding. I need to double-check. Malcolm handed over the tickets. Lauren looked. 1B. Valid. But Evelyn stood right behind them. Her breathing was rapid. Lauren, she said, I wasn't sitting behind them. Lauren swallowed. Gentlemen, could you please switch seats? Where are we going to trade? Marcus asked. Premium economy. A moment of silence. Malcolm stood up. "Let me make that clear," he said. "We paid over $10,000 for this seat. She wanted it, and you ladies asked us to leave." Lauren remained silent. Marcus took out his phone. He said nothing. He just turned on the recording function. Evelyn took a deep breath. "See, that's how dangerous it is." Lauren called the intercom. "Captain to first class." And that was the moment Marcus realized something very clearly. This flight will not take off as scheduled. The airplane cabin was eerily silent. All eyes were fixed on the cockpit entrance. The sound of a door opening. The captain stepped out. And he didn't ask who they were. John F. Kennedy International Airport Terminal 4, 6:10 p.m. The atmosphere in the first-class lounge has a very distinctive smell. The smell of money, of power, of people accustomed to being served without having to ask. Champagne glasses clinked softly. Whispers of conversation filled the air about stocks, real estate, and deals nearing completion. Everything flowed smoothly and orderly, as if the world had been designed specifically for a particular group of people. In the corner of the room, near the window overlooking the runway, Marcus Reed and Malcolm Reed sat side by side. Twin brothers. 36 years old. Black, CEO. They weren't wearing fancy suits, just dark, gray hoodies, dark pants, and clean leather shoes. No logos, no showing off. The other people in the waiting room paid no attention to them. Or if they did, it was only a very quick glance, like someone looking at something that doesn't belong there. Marcus was reviewing a final email on his phone. Malcolm closed his eyes, his head resting lightly against the chair, breathing slowly. "Are you tired?" Marcus asked softly. "No," Malcolm replied. "I'm just reminiscing. About my first time flying first class." Marcus chuckled softly without looking up. "I had my ticket with me for the entire trip." "Yes," Malcolm opened his eyes. "I'm afraid they'll change their minds." They were both silent for a few seconds. It's not because they're sad. It's because they understand that feeling very well. 15 years ago, Marcus and Malcolm Reed stood in line at Atlanta Airport waiting for the cheapest flight home after a startup conference. They were checked in with their luggage twice. They were asked, "What do you guys do for a living?" They were looked at as if they were in the wrong place. They are now co-founders of Reed Logistics Group, a company that controls cargo distribution centers at 3 major airports in Europe. Today's deal in London is worth more than $420 million. But old memories don't disappear just because you've succeeded. The voice from the loudspeaker rang out soft but firm. First-class passengers on North Atlantic Air Flight 617 to London Heathrow are now boarding. Marcus stood up first, zipping up his small leather bag. Malcolm followed. They walked to the control counter. The officer scanned their tickets. The machine beeps. The light is green. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Reed." Then came the second ticket. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Reed." "No problems. At least not yet." The first-class cabin of the Boeing 787 is spacious and quiet. Seats 1A and 1B bulkhead, no seats in front. Open space. Absolute privacy. Malcolm sat in the aisle seat. Marcus sat in the window seat. They fastened their seatbelts. No further explanation was given. A flight attendant approached. Her name was Emily. She was in her early 30s. She had a professional smile. "Gentlemen, would you like something to drink before takeoff?" "Filtered water will do," Marcus replied. "Thank." Emily nodded and turned away. "Everything is fine. Until..." She appeared. The sound of high heels echoed before anyone could see the wearer. A sharp, cold click on the carpet. Patricia Whitmore. She was about 55 years old. She wore a light-colored fur coat. An expensive leather handbag hung loosely on her arm. She stopped right at the front of the compartment, looked at the tickets, looked at the seats. Then she looked at Marcus and Malcolm. Her gaze lingered longer than necessary. "Excuse me," she said, her voice high and clear. "You're in the wrong place." Malcolm opened his eyes and turned. "Excuse me, these are my and my husband's seats," Patricia said, pointing. "We always sit in the front row." Marcus calmly pulled the tickets from his jacket pocket. "Seats 1A and 1B. "Reed," Patricia scoffed. "Impossible. There must be a mistake." The atmosphere around us became tense. Marcus didn't argue. He just showed the ticket, obviously. Patricia refused. She turned and called out loudly, "Emily, flight attendant." Emily turned around, her eyes scanning quickly. Then they settled on the two brothers. "What's the matter, Mrs. Whitmore?" These two are sitting in my seat, Patricia said quickly. They might have been upgraded by mistake. Emily paused slightly. She looked at Patricia's ticket. Then she looked towards Marcus and Malcolm. Gentlemen, can I see your boarding passes again? Marcus handed her the ticket. Emily looked at it. Seat number, name. Everything is valid. But Patricia stood close, by her voice lowered. Emily, I can't sit behind them for 8 hours. Emily looked up. She understood, not rationally, but habitually. She turned to Marcus. Sir, there might be a slight adjustment. We can arrange for 2 other seats for you. Which chair? Malcolm asked. Premium economy, row 14. Very comfortable. Marcus looked directly at Emily. Not angry, not raising his voice. We paid for these seats. Patricia crossed her arms. That's unbelievable. She spoke loudly enough for everyone in the cabin to hear. I don't feel safe sitting near people who are so aggressive. Malcolm took a deep breath. He was familiar with that word. Aggressive, threatening, inappropriate. Marcus placed his hand on his brother's hand, gently, as a signal. We won't be changing seats, Marcus said slowly. If needed, call the manager. Emily swallowed hard. She turned and walked quickly toward the cockpit. Patricia smiled, a smile of early victory. You should know your place. Marcus didn't answer. He just looked out the window. Outside, another plane was taxiing slowly. Its engines hummed softly. He recalled what his father had once said. You don't need to shout to prove you're right. Just stand still and let the truth do the rest. Malcolm tightened his seatbelt. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew. A storm was coming. The first-class cabin is gradually becoming more crowded. One by one they entered, carrying the scent of expensive perfume, the gentle rolling of suitcase wheels on the thick carpet, and the familiar energy of people accustomed to being served. A tech CEO sat down in seat 2, wearing noise-canceling headphones. An elderly couple in tweed suits sat in the row behind him, whispering about the London weather. Ethan Carter and Elijah Carter remained seated. They didn't look around. They didn't scrutinize. They didn't try to prove that they belonged here. Just sit there, calmly. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his gaze fixed on the airplane window where the New York evening sky was turning a gray. He had flown this route countless times, but each time he sat in first class he still had a strange feeling. Not pride, rather, vigilance. Elijah gently unbuttoned his vest, taking a deep breath. He looked at the seat's control panel, then glanced at his brother. Did you hear that? Elijah whispered. What do you want to hear? Ethan replied, his voice even. It wasn't the sound. Elijah shook his head. It was the eyes. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He knew exactly what Elijah was talking about. From the moment they boarded the plane, glances had swept over them. Quick, silent, but long enough to notice. It wasn't a curious look, nor was it one of admiration. Rather, it's a measuring gaze. It was as if someone was wondering, are these two really first-class passengers? Ethan smiled softly, very gently. I'm used to it, he said. Just let them look. Elijah shrugged. I'm just tired of that never changing. Ethan turned to look at his younger brother. His eyes held neither sadness nor anger, just depth. Change is slow, he said, but it's not like there's no change at all. The chief flight attendant appeared. Her name was Melissa Grant. She was in her early 40s. Her blonde hair was neatly cut. Her movements were as precise as a Swiss watch. She stood upright in front of seats 1A, 1B, flashing a standard smile. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome aboard Atlantic Crown Flight 317 to London Heathrow. Her voice was polite, but her eyes darted around very quickly. Too fast. Can I see your boarding passes, please, Melissa Noy? Elijah frowned slightly. We scanned it at the door, he replied, still handing out the ticket. Melissa took the ticket, looked down. 1 second, 2 seconds. She said nothing. She just nodded slightly. Thank you. Then he turned and left. Ethan watched her back, his expression unchanged. But a familiar thought echoed in his mind. Here we go again. It's not about checking tickets. It's about checking only their tickets. No one in the back seat was questioned. Elijah exhaled. Do you see? He said very softly. The way she looks. Ethan nodded. I see. And we still have to pretend not to see. Ethan placed his hand on his younger brother's hand. It's not a pretense, he said. It's a choice. Then she appeared. As the first-class cabin door closed, the sound of high heels clicking echoed sharp and rapid. The woman was in her 50s. She was wearing a cream-colored trench coat and carrying a burgundy crocodile leather handbag. She didn't step into the compartment. She walked in, as if this place had always belonged to her. She stopped at the front of the compartment, looking around. Her gaze swept over each seat and settled on Ethan and Elijah a very long time. She frowned. Then she looked down at her ticket. Then she looked at them again. An expression of displeasure was clearly visible on her face. She walked straight to the front row. "Excuse me," she said, her voice high and sharp. "You're in my seats." Elijah opened his eyes. "Excuse me," he asked calmly. She held the ticket up in front of him. "Row 1, always row 1. Her voice was firm like a command. Ethan took out his ticket, placed it next to hers without standing up. 1A and 1B, he said. "That's exactly what our tickets say." The woman looked at the two tickets. Then she looked at them. A cold smile. "That's impossible, Banoy. I fly this route every month. They don't put people like you up here." The statement wasn't loud, but it was clear enough. The air in the first-class cabin was freezing. Elijah felt his chest tighten. A part of him wanted to stand up and retort immediately, but Ethan remained seated. "Ma'am," Ethan said, his voice low and very slow. "If there's any confusion, we can call a flight attendant." The woman smirked. "Oh, I already planned to." She spun around and snapped her fingers. Melissa, the chief flight attendant, turned around and walked quickly towards them. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore?" she asked. Her name was Margaret Whitmore, a name that smells of old money. "These men are in our seats," Margaret said without even looking at Ethan and Elijah. "Fix it." Melissa looked at Ethan. Then Elijah. Then the ticket in Margaret's hand. She hesitated. "Mrs. Whitmore, according to the manifest." "I don't care about the manifest, Margaret Cottongang. I care about my comfort." Then she leaned over and spoke softly, but loud enough for everyone in the compartment to hear. "I didn't pay first class to sit next to this." Elijah felt the blood rush to his face, but Ethan remained silent. It's not because he's weak. It's because he's observing. Observe how Melissa avoids their gaze. Observe how the other passengers lower their heads, pretending not to hear. Observe the silence of the first-class cabin. And he understood. This isn't just a seat. This is a test. Melissa took a deep breath. "Gentlemen, Konoi, Jeong Chuan, Sang Kung. There seems to be a seating conflict. For now, could you please step out while we resolve this?" Elijah chuckled softly. "Step out?" he asked. "We're in the right seats." "Sir," Melissa said, her voice rising. "Please cooperate." Ethan placed his phone on the armrest of the seat. He turned on recording mode. He stood up very slowly. "We're willing to cooperate," Ethan said, "but we're not willing to be treated like we're in the wrong." Margaret Whitmore folded her arms, a triumphant look in her eyes. "I knew it," she said, aggressive. Ethan turned to look at her. No anger, no contempt, just stay calm. "Ma'am," he said, "my calmness is not weakness, and my silence is not consent." The entire compartment fell silent. Melissa swallowed. "Captain will be informed, Konoi Han. Please remain seated." Ethan nodded. "We're here." And at that moment, Elijah looked at his brother and suddenly realized something very clearly. This is no longer a flight. This is no longer a minor dispute. This is when the line is crossed. And when that line is crossed, someone will have to pay the price. The plane hasn't taken off yet, but the wheels of a chain of events have already begun to turn. The familiar sound of the airplane engine echoed steadily, a low, cold rhythm, so stable that it was easy to become complacent. Ethan Cole leaned back in seat 1A, his eyes gazing out the window. The New York evening sky was tinged with a silvery gray, thick clouds swirling like layers of unspoken thoughts. Beside him, Elijah Cole, his twin brother, had his eyes closed. Not asleep. Just didn't want to look. Two black men in well-fitting dark suits sat upright silently in their proper places. They didn't take up anyone's space. They made no noise. They didn't demand any special privileges. They simply exist, and for some people that alone is annoying. Ethan recognized the eyes even before he heard the voice. A glance swept over him, paused, then turned back again. Not harsh, not overt, but long enough for the person being watched to sense it. Ethan turned his head slightly, and met the gaze of a woman sitting behind him in row 2A. She was in her 50s, neatly dressed with a cold and somewhat scrutinizing look in her eyes. She quickly turned away when Ethan looked back. Elijah opened his eyes. "You saw it too." Elijah's voice was low, just loud enough for the two of them to hear. Ethan nodded slightly. "Yes. Needless to say, they're used to it. There's a truth that very few white people have to learn, but most successful black people understand very well. You can buy a first-class seat, but you won't always be accepted as belonging to it." Ethan took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. A very old image flashed through his mind. A 12-year-old boy, sitting in a classroom in suburban Ohio, the only black student in his advanced math class. What did the teacher say that day? "I think you should move down to the regular class. Maybe this program is a little too challenging." Ethan didn't cry then. He just nodded. Elijah was different. Elijah always asked, "Why? What are you thinking about?" Elijah asked. "I think," Ethan paused for a moment, "whether this time will be like the previous times." Elijah gave a very slight smile. "It's always the same." Footsteps echoed in the first-class cabin. The chief flight attendant, Melissa Grant, appeared. A white woman around 40 with a sharp face and a professional smile. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said in a perfectly polished, trained voice. "Can we serve drinks before takeoff?" "Give me some water," Ethan said. Elijah nodded. "Me too." Melissa memorized quickly, but her gaze lingered on the two brothers, longer than necessary. Not hostile, just an assessment. She turned away. Elijah leaned closer to Ethan. "Did you notice? She was looking at us like she was confirming something." "Confirm what?" "Let's confirm whether we should really be sitting here." Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his gleaming leather shoes. The same shoes he'd worn during the $480 million contract signing 3 days earlier. He wondered how many numbers would be enough to stop being seen that way. The airplane cabin was starting to get more crowded. A middle-aged white man wearing a navy blue blazer walked to the front row. He looked at the seat numbers, 1A, 1B. Then he paused. "Excuse me," he said, his voice polite but firm, it seems. "There's some kind of misunderstanding." Ethan turned back calm. "No, sir." The man frowned. "I always sit in the front row." Elijah smiled very slightly, a smile that wasn't meant to be provocative. "Not today." The atmosphere around us became tense. The man looked at the two brothers for a few more seconds, then he grunted softly and continued walking with his suitcase to the back. No one said anything, but a few other passengers began to watch. Eyes whispered, "Who are they? Why are they there? Do they belong here?" Ethan sensed it clearly. It wasn't fear. It was something far more familiar, a quiet vigilance. He learned this very early on, in the meeting room, in the elevator, in the upscale restaurant. There should always be a portion of your mind dedicated to reading. Who is upset? Who is waiting for you to make a mistake? Who is willing to believe you are unworthy? Elijah is different. Elijah didn't read the room. Elijah memorized it. Melissa turned around and placed 2 glasses of water in front of them. "Today's flight is very crowded," she said, as if giving an explanation no one asked for. Ethan nodded. Melissa hesitated for a moment. "Is there a problem?" she asked. "No," Ethan replied. "We're fine." She looked at him. Then she looked at Elijah. It was a very brief second, but enough for Ethan to realize she was considering something. Melissa turned away. Elijah lowered his voice. "Did you see it?" "Yes." "They're looking for an explanation." In seat 2A, the woman from earlier leaned over to talk to her husband. Her voice was low enough, but the quiet airplane cabin allowed a few words to slip through. "Doesn't feel safe." Ethan closed his eyes. Not because of fear, but because of exhaustion. There's a kind of fatigue that doesn't show on your face. It just accumulates over the years. Elijah tightened his grip on the handrail. "Do you have anything to say?" Elijah asked. "No," Ethan said. "Not yet." He understands the rules of the game very well. An angry black person is always seen as a threat. A silent black person is seen as suspicious. Between those two options, Ethan chose patience. The compartment door closed. A ding sound rang out. The plane is preparing for taxiing, but Ethan knew this was just the beginning of something bigger. He glanced at Elijah. Elijah looked back at him. No words needed. Both brothers sensed that something was coming. Quiet. Not sudden, but definitely. In the cockpit, small decisions are being made. In the passenger compartment, old prejudices are stirring. And in seats 1A, 1B, two black men sit still, letting the world reveal its true face. Ethan thought to himself, if today is the day they make the wrong choice, then they will be held responsible for that choice. The plane began to move, a journey that not only flies across the ocean but also pierces through human pride has officially begun. No one in the station knew that. What had just happened wasn't the climax yet. The two brothers stood by the large glass window of the terminal. Outside, the wide-body aircraft remained motionless. The engines were not yet running. The beacon lights still flickered slowly and steadily like the heartbeat of a giant sleeping beast. Around them, people continued to move about, pulling suitcases, talking on the phone, buying coffee. Life went on as if nothing had happened. But for the two brothers, things were calming down, preparing for a bigger collision. No one said anything for almost a minute. It's not because there's nothing to say. It's because they both understand this moment all too well. That moment when a wrong reaction could cause everything to slip through your fingers. The older brother looked out at the runway. His eyes held no anger, no bitterness, just a somber expression. He'd been through this before. In boardrooms where he was the only black person. In business deals where partners pretended not to hear him until someone else repeated the exact same thing. Discrimination isn't always noisy. Sometimes it's very polite. Very procedural. The younger man leaned against the metal railing, exhaling slowly. He knew that if he let anger take over, all his advantages would vanish. "Are you all right?" the younger brother asked, his voice low. "I'm fine," the older brother replied. "It's just a little sad." It's sad because even now, as CEOs, having signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars and having created jobs for thousands of people, they can still be seen as not belonging here. But the sadness didn't last long. Because at that very moment, the phone in my younger sibling's hand rang. Not a call. It was a text message. Just one line. "Where are you?" The younger brother looked at the screen. He didn't reply immediately. He knew who sent it. And he also knew, once he replied, things would never go back to how they were. He looked up at his brother. Just a very slight nod. No explanation needed. My younger sibling replied, Gate B, 32. "We've just been asked to disembark." 3 seconds later, the phone vibrated again. "Don't go anywhere. Stay right there. That's all." Not an apology, not a question. But the two brothers understood. That statement wasn't a proposal. On the other side of the window, in the first-class cabin, the woman was still seated in the front row. Her legs were stretched out, a glass of champagne in her hand. She felt no anxiety at all. On the contrary, she felt victorious. She was used to this feeling. Just raise her voice a little, just act a little more annoyed. Everything would be arranged to her liking. The chief flight attendant stood nearby, trying to maintain a professional expression. But inwardly, she was beginning to feel very uneasy. It wasn't because the two passengers had just been kicked off. It was because something else wasn't right. The plane should have taxied, but it didn't. The pilot hadn't closed the cockpit door. The internal radio was unusually silent. A passenger in the back row whispered, "Why haven't they left yet?" The flight attendant smiled reassuringly. "They're probably just waiting for the signal." But even she didn't believe what she said. Back to the train station, the two brothers remained standing there. They didn't move. They didn't call anyone else. They didn't post anything. They didn't record any videos. They understood one thing clearly. True power doesn't need to be loud. A man in a dark blue suit appeared at the end of the hallway. He walked quickly. Too quickly for someone who was just checking in. He was followed by 2 airport security officers. People around them started to take notice. The man stopped in front of the two brothers. He bowed slightly. "Sorry for keeping you two waiting." His voice was low, urgent, not at all polite. "We need to talk. Don't ask. Are you free? Don't ask. Is it possible?" The two brothers looked at each other, then nodded. "Get on the plane." The jet bridge doors opened once again. This time, it's not to see them off, but to bring them back. The chief flight attendant stood frozen when she saw that. The woman in the front seat dropped her phone onto the floor. For a moment, no one said anything. No need. The silence at this moment was heavier than any shouting. The man in the blue suit entered the cabin. He didn't look at the passengers. He didn't look at the flight attendants. He held the internal microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice was clear and decisive. This flight is temporarily suspended for staff adjustments. A wave of murmurs arose. The woman jumped up. Adjust what I have a meeting in London. The man turned to her. His gaze didn't waver. Ma'am, I request that you maintain order. Just one sentence. Don't raise your voice. Don't be offensive. But it was enough for everyone in the cabin to understand. The balance had shifted. The man turned to the two brothers. He bowed slightly again. Please have a seat, gentlemen. We'll handle the rest. The older brother looked around the compartment. Curious glances. Surprised glances. A few embarrassed glances. He nodded, calmly. As he sat down in his chair, the feeling wasn't one of victory, but it's a very familiar kind of fatigue, because he knew things didn't need to go this far. The plane hasn't taken off yet, but one thing is clear. Not everyone who wears a hoodie is powerless, and not everyone who sits in the front row has the power to make decisions. The storm hasn't arrived yet, but the sky had begun to change color. There are moments in life when silence is not a sign of weakness. Silence is a choice, and sometimes, silence is the sharpest weapon a person can carry. Ethan Carter and Elijah Carter stood side by side in front of the glass door of the first-class lounge at JFK Airport, Terminal 7. Outside, the New York sky was a pale gray, and a light drizzle fell like a thin layer of dust covering the city. Inside, the air was thick and heavy. No one said anything, but everyone sensed that something was wrong. Elijah adjusted his cuff, his steel watch slightly scratched by time, not by lack of money. He glanced at his brother. Ethan remained still. Back straight, shoulders relaxed, his gaze calm yet as deep as the surface of water before a storm. "Are you all right?" Elijah asked softly. Ethan nodded. "I'm fine. It's just, I've been in this moment before." Elijah understood immediately. No explanation needed. This wasn't the first time they'd been looked at as if they didn't belong here. A ground staff member approached, a standard smile, a well-trained voice. "Excuse me, gentlemen, I need to double-check your tickets." Elijah handed over the ticket immediately. Ethan didn't. He looked directly into the employee's eyes, his voice slow and deliberate. "We checked in. We went through security. We were escorted to the first-class lounge. Can you explain why we need to check again?" The employee paused slightly. "For a second. Just a second. Oh, it's just procedure, sir." Ethan smiled very slightly. A smile that was neither friendly nor confrontational. The process is never random. The air around them rippled slightly. The employee glanced toward the reception desk. There stood Margaret Whitmore, a cream-colored cashmere coat, her hair neatly styled, a woman who exuded an air of privilege. Her gaze swept over the Carter brothers, lingered too long on Ethan, then turned away as if she had confirmed something in her mind. Margaret stepped forward. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft but loud enough for those around her to hear. The staff member bowed and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, there's been a slight mix-up regarding seating arrangements." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "A mistake." Then she looked directly at Ethan and Elijah. No concealment, no hesitation. "Oh," a short "oh" but full of meaning. "I think I understand now." Elijah tightened his grip slightly, not out of fear, but because he was all too familiar with this moment. Margaret turned to the flight attendant and said, "My family always sits in the front row on this flight. I have circulatory problems. I need a bulkhead seat." Ethan spoke up, his voice still even. "We're also sitting in bulkhead seats. According to our tickets." Margaret looked him up and down. Her gaze lingered on Ethan's simple jacket, his plain leather shoes, and then returned to his face. "Really?" She gave a wry smile. "Are you sure you're not mistaken?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He turned to Elijah. "Do you remember what Dad said?" Elijah nodded. "I remember." Ethan's voice lowered. "Dad said, when someone tries to make you feel like you don't belong, it's not because you're small. It's because they're afraid you'll grow bigger than they think." Margaret frowned. She didn't like this kind of talk. "I don't have time for philosophy," she interrupted. "I just want to sit in my place." Ethan nodded. "Me too." A moment of silence ensued. Then Laura Simmons, the chief flight attendant, appeared. "What's the problem here?" she asked. Margaret turned immediately, her voice becoming more friendly. "Laura, I'm very sorry to have to say this, but these two are sitting in my seat." Laura looked at Ethan and Elijah, then at the tickets, then back at Margaret. She knew. She knew from the beginning. The ticket is valid, the name matches, there are no errors. But Laura also knew who Margaret Whitmore was. And she also knew that this system often rewarded those who made noise. Laura took a deep breath. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice softening, "would you be able to switch to premium economy? We will help cover part of the cost." Elijah chuckled. Not loudly, just a bitter sigh. Ethan didn't smile. He looked directly at Laura. "You just asked us to give up our paid seats to alleviate someone else's inconvenience simply because that person's request was significant enough." Laura remained silent. Margaret folded her arms. "Don't make a big deal out of it," she said. "Some people are suited to certain spaces." The words fell like a rock. No one spoke, but many people heard. Ethan could clearly feel his heartbeat. Not too fast, not too slow. He remembered the early years of his career. Meetings where he was asked, "Are you really the CEO?" Half-hearted handshakes. Suspicious glances. He used to get angry. He used to argue. And then he learned a lesson. True power doesn't lie in speaking louder. It lies in knowing when to let others reveal their true nature. Ethan took out his phone. No video, no audio recording. He only called one number. "Elijah," he said softly, "I think the time has come." Elijah nodded. He didn't ask any further questions. "The call is connected." Jonathan Ethan's voice was low and clear. "We're at JFK. There's a small issue with Ether Air Flight 614. There was a moment of silence on the other end. Then the voice changed. "You said, Aether 614. Yes. Don't hang up." Ethan turned off the speakerphone. He put the phone in his pocket. Margaret smirked. "Who are you calling?" "A lawyer." Ethan looked at her. His gaze was calm. "Are not." He paused for a moment. "I am the one who signed the lease agreement for this airport. The air is freezing." Laura stood frozen. The ground staff swallowed hard. Margaret forced a smile. "Are you kidding me?" Ethan didn't answer. In the distance, the sound of a walkie-talkie could be heard. There were hurried footsteps. A senior manager was approaching. Elijah whispered, "It's starting." Ethan nodded, but he didn't feel victorious. No triumph, no satisfaction. He just felt sad. It's sad that situations like this still exist. It's sad that some people only learn their lesson when the price is too high. The plane outside the window remained stationary, but an earthquake was brewing. There are moments in life when people stop arguing, stop explaining, and stop trying to prove they are right. They were silent, and it was that silence that made the whole room begin to feel uneasy. The first-class cabin of North Atlantic Crown Flight 718 was in that state. Nobody said anything. No one moved. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the air conditioner and the slow, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the electronic display near the cabin door. Ethan Cole remained seated in seat 1A. Evan Cole was in 1B, his back straight, his hands resting lightly on his thighs. Two black men dressed in simple dark gray suits, no logos, no ostentation, yet exuded an energy that made those who met them wary. It's not because they're aggressive. It's because they're too calm. Margaret Whitmore was the one who broke that silence. She cleared her throat loudly. A deliberate clearing of the throat. "Where's the captain?" Her voice rang out, shrill and tinged with the annoyance of someone accustomed to giving orders and always getting them obeyed. "I can't believe I have to sit here waiting just because of this nonsense." Linda Parker, the chief flight attendant, stood by the aisle, her lips pressed together. She was starting to feel sweat beading on the back of her neck. Things were no longer as under her control as she thought. Linda turned to Ethan and Evan, trying to keep her voice calm. "Gentlemen, I'll repeat this one last time. We're trying to resolve a sensitive situation. If you two cooperate and move, things will be resolved more quickly." Evan looked up, slowly. His gaze wasn't harsh, not challenging. It's just a chillingly alert feeling. "Miss," Linda Evans said, his voice low, "and even I'd like to clarify something. You're asking us to move from the seats indicated on our tickets because another passenger wants them, right?" Linda paused. The question is so obvious, so direct. She avoided Evan's gaze. "That's a special situation." Ethan chuckled softly. It wasn't a mocking laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had heard this phrase too many times in their life. Specifically for whom, Ethan asked. For the passengers, or for the system? No one answered. Margaret Whitmore crossed her arms, her lips curving into a thin smile. "I don't have time for moralistic lectures," she said. "I've been flying this route for 20 years. I know who belongs in this cabin and who doesn't. The saying needs no explanation. It carries its own meaning." Inside the cabin, several other passengers bowed their heads. Some closed their eyes. Others pretended to look at their phones. No one stepped forward. Ethan looked out the window. The JFK runway stretched out with other planes lined up to take off. He let out a very soft sigh. Old memories suddenly flooded back into his mind. When he was a student, he was followed closely by mall security. The day he wore a suit to meet investors, he was asked, "Are you sure you're on the right floor?" The day he walked into a meeting room, people assumed he was an assistant. Ethan learned one thing very early on. Anger only reassures others that they are right. It is calmness that makes them begin to fear. He turned to Evan and nodded very slightly. Evan understands. He unbuckled his seatbelt. "Stand up." A slight murmur arose in the airplane cabin. Linda Parker immediately took half a step back. "What are you planning to do?" she asked, her voice tense. "We're leaving the plane," Evan said. "Not because we're wrong, but because we won't tolerate any more humiliation." Margaret burst out laughing. "Finally, you understand," she said. "See, Linda, just be firm, and it'll work." Ethan stood up as well. He retrieved the small leather bag from the overhead compartment. The movement was neat, unhurried, without anger, just definitely. As the two brothers stepped out into the aisle, a middle-aged man sitting in the back seat spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "I'm sorry for not saying anything." Evan paused for a moment, turned his head. He nodded at the man. "Thank you," Evan said. "At least you noticed." They stepped out of the first-class cabin. The separating door closed behind them. As Ethan and Evan stepped into the jet tunnel, the cold New York evening air hit them in the face. No more soft yellow lights in the airplane cabin. No more gentle hum of the air conditioning. The only sounds were the airport noises, the announcements over the loudspeakers, the rolling of luggage wheels on the stone floor. Linda Parker followed behind her voice cold. "Your tickets will be marked as indicating a refusal to comply with flight crew instructions. The airline will consider restricting your future flights." Ethan stopped walking. "Turn around slowly." His eyes looked completely different now. "It's no longer about patience. It's no longer about silence. It is absolute certainty. Miss Linda," Ethan said, "I advise you to record everything accurately, because what just happened will be scrutinized very carefully." Linda frowned. "Are you threatening me?" Evan spoke up, his voice calm. "No, we're just memorizing." The two brothers continued walking. Exit the cell. The door slammed shut behind them with a dry click. Inside the cockpit, Captain Robert Hayes was listening to Linda's quick report. "They've left the plane," Linda said. "Two passengers were causing a disturbance. I suggested notifying them and continuing the flight." Robert nodded without much thought. "All right," he said. "We can't afford to delay the flight because of these trivial matters." Margaret Whitmore was now comfortably seated in seat 1A. She stretched her legs and took a sip of champagne. "Finally, things are calm," she said, turning to her silent husband beside her. "I told you so. Just make a big fuss about it." The plane began to back away from the gate. The cabin lights dimmed. No one noticed that. In another corner of the airport, Evan Cole was opening his phone's contact list. His finger stopped at a name. Jonathan Reed, CEO of North Atlantic Crown. Evan looked at Ethan. The two brothers said nothing, just a glance. Ethan nodded. Evan pressed the call button. The phone rang. After a while, 2X. The person on the other end of the line answered. Jonathan Reed, listening. Evan took a deep breath. "Jonathan," he said, his voice calm, "we've just been kicked off your flight, and you need to know why." On the other end of the line, a long silence ensued. This time, silence was no longer on the side of those on the plane. There was a very strange moment in the airplane cabin. No one said anything. No one moved. But everyone understood. The tide had turned. Marcus Reed stood silently in the aisle of first class. The ceiling lights shone down on his dark blue vest, revealing subtle creases, signs of a long day, a flight that was no longer an ordinary one. Beside him, Malcolm Reed remained seated in seat 1A. His seatbelt was unbuckled. His hands rested lightly on the armrests, his fingers neither gripping nor trembling. He doesn't need to stand up to prove anything. At the front, Daniel Hoffman, station manager of Atlantic Crown Airlines, was holding the intercom. His voice wasn't loud, not harsh, but each word that fell into the cabin felt like a heavy stone. Captain Louis Daniel said slowly he is instructed to leave the cockpit immediately. A moment of silence. Then the cockpit door opened. Captain Robert Lewis appeared. His face still tried to maintain a stern expression, but his eyes betrayed something rapidly crumbling beneath the surface. "Daniel," he said, his voice harsh, "I need to know what you're doing. I have the right." "No," Daniel interrupted. "You have the right." That statement wasn't offensive at all, but it took everything away. Lewis turned to look at Marcus and Malcolm. For the first time, he looked at them very closely. Not the gaze of a commander, but the gaze of someone who has just realized they misjudged the situation from the start. Marcus didn't look back. He looked down at the carpet. A still wet champagne stain, a trace of recently shattered pride. Evelyn Carter was sitting stiffly in seat 2A. Her hand clutched the camel-colored leather bag tightly. Her nude-painted fingernails dug into the strap, turning it white. She no longer leaned back. No longer stretched her legs out into the bulkhead space. Her back was straight, like someone awaiting judgment. Evelyn glanced at her husband, Richard Carter. He bowed his head, his hands clasped together. He said nothing. Marcus heard Evelyn's hurried breathing, soft, but irregular. He understands that feeling when you think you're standing high up, and then suddenly realize the ground beneath your feet isn't there anymore. Daniel Hoffman put the interphone back on track. He turned toward the compartment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "I apologize for the interruption. We are dealing with an internal matter. Please remain seated." He turned to look at Marcus and Malcolm. "Mr. Reed," Daniel said, May we speak privately for a moment?" Marcus nodded. He turned to Malcolm. The two brothers said nothing. It wasn't necessary. Malcolm stood up and put his vest back on. They walked toward the compartment door where Daniel was standing. Each step is slow, unpretentious, unconventional. But everyone in first class was watching. There are victories that don't need applause. In the front galley, the door was closed. The sounds from outside faded away. Daniel let out a long sigh. For the first time since boarding the plane, his shoulders slumped. I'm sorry," he said. No flowery language, no blaming. "I've seen the initial report, and I've seen the video." Marcus didn't answer immediately. He looked at the steel surface of the galley cabinet. It reflected a faint image, a black man standing upright, his eyes devoid of anger. "I don't need a personal apology," Marcus said after a few seconds. His voice was low, clear. "I need to know where this is going to end." Daniel nodded. "Captain Lewis and Chief Flight Attendant Susan Miller will be suspended immediately," he said. "An internal investigation will begin tonight." Malcolm spoke up. "And who was the passenger who caused the incident?" Daniel was silent for a moment. "The Carter family," he said, "will be asked to leave the flight." Marcus turned to look at him. "It's not because of us," he said. "It's because of their behavior." Daniel nodded again. "Correct." The galley door opened. Daniel stepped out first. Marcus and Malcolm followed. The first-class cabin reappeared. The atmosphere has changed. Daniel stopped in the middle of the walkway. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice calm, "I need you and Mr. Carter to prepare to disembark." Evelyn jumped up, what she almost screamed. "You can't! I'm a platinum guest! My husband!" "You violated the code of conduct," Daniel said without raising his voice. "And so did you." Evelyn Quay sang Marcus. Her eyes no longer held contempt. They were filled with panic. You can't do this," she said, her voice trembling. Just because of a misunderstanding, Marcus looked at her. A very long time. Then he spoke. "She wasn't treated unfairly," he said. "She's just experiencing something new, not being given preferential treatment." The words weren't harsh, but they came crashing down like a hammer. Richard Carter stood up. He took his wife's hand. "Evelyn," he said softly, "that's enough." She stood still for a second. "Then take the bag." No further comments. They walked down the aisle, past Marcus and Malcolm. Evelyn bowed her head. She didn't look up. When the airplane door closed again, the first-class cabin fell silent. Another kind of silence. No more tension, no more confrontation. Only the echoes remain. Marcus returned to seat 1B. Malcolm sat down in 1A. The flight attendant just brought the water. Sir, she said softly, we are very sorry for what happened. Marcus nodded. Thank you, he said. You did a good job. The plane began to taxi. Malcolm looked out the window. You see, he said softly, they don't understand. Until the power changes. Marcus leaned his head back against the chair. No, he replied. They understand. But they've never had to pay the price. He closed his eyes. For the first time since boarding the plane, he allowed himself to breathe more slowly. At an altitude of 10,000 feet, Atlantic Crown Airlines has just avoided a major storm. But underground, another storm is beginning to form. And Marcus Reed knew this story isn't over yet. There was a very strange moment on the plane at that time. No one said anything. No one dared to move. After the woman was asked to leave her seat, the atmosphere in first class was like the surface of water before a storm. Calm. But so tense that a single, strong breath would be enough to shatter it. The two brothers stood there. No anger, no blatant victory. Just silence. And it was that silence that made it difficult for everyone else to breathe. A young flight attendant who had just been assigned to replace her shift stood pressed against the wall. She clutched the instruction sheet tightly in her hand, avoiding eye contact. She knew. Everyone knew. This had gone far beyond a mere seating dispute. It has become a test of morality. The new captain stepped out of the cockpit. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't give any orders. He just glanced around the cabin, then bowed very slightly towards the two brothers. We apologize for what happened, he said slowly. I know this apology comes late. The older brother looked at him. His gaze was calm, devoid of hostility. Thank you for saying that, he replied. Not everyone has the courage. The remark wasn't meant as a condemnation, but it made the captain pause for a moment, because he understood that some words, even when spoken loudly, can still be as heavy as stone. The plane hasn't taken off yet. The cabin lights are still on, but somewhere out there the real storm is just beginning. While the technical crew was checking the entire flight, the two brothers sat down, not the old seats. A different row of seats had just been thoroughly cleaned. The younger brother leaned back, closed his eyes. Not sleeping, just breathing. He thought of his father, a black man who had driven trucks across states for 20 years, the man who had taught him, if you have to raise your voice to prove you're right, you've already lost a part of the battle. When he was a child, he didn't understand. Today, he understands very well. The older brother looked out the window. The runway stretched on its yellow lights like a ribbon of memories. He recalled dozens of meetings where he had to speak twice as slowly, softly, and politely as everyone else, just to be considered easy to work with. He remembered being asked, "Are you sure you're the CEO? Who are you with? How long have you worked here?" None of that is new. It's just that today it happened in an unexpected place, on an airplane, in the highest class, with a fully paid ticket. The message started vibrating in my pocket. Not the press, not social media. They are people who understand things faster than the media. A board of directors, a long-standing partner, an executive from Europe. No one asked what happened. They asked, "Are you okay?" That single question was enough to open my younger brother's eyes. He replied to each message. "Not long. No rambling. We're fine. Thank you." Then he put the phone away. There are times when speaking less helps conserve energy. Meanwhile, at the other end of the airport, the other woman was sitting in the security waiting area. No more fur coat, no more haughty demeanor. All that remained was a mixture of confusion and anger. She kept calling. Lawyers, friends, acquaintances. But no one answered the phone. It's not because they didn't hear. It's because they saw. The video has started to go viral. No editing, no commentary. It's just a picture. And the truth. Back in the airplane cabin, the captain announced that they were preparing for takeoff. His voice was more steady this time. "Thank you for your patience." The two brothers fastened their seatbelts. As the engine began to roar, the younger brother whispered very softly, "Do you ever get tired of having to stay calm all the time?" The older brother didn't answer immediately. He waited for the engine noise to settle. Then he spoke, "Yes, but I'd be more tired if I let them decide who I am." The plane took off. The city gradually shrank. The lights faded into tiny dots of light. At that moment, there was no victory, only a very strange feeling. Light. It wasn't because everything was over. It was because they knew that this time they wouldn't bow their heads. When the flight attendant brought the water, she paused briefly. "Thank you both," she said softly. for not making things worse. The younger brother smiled. We just did what we had to do. She nodded, her eyes slightly red, then she turned away. Sometimes change doesn't come from those who shout. It comes from those who are patient enough to stand still. The plane flew into the clouds. The light outside turned silver. The older brother closed his eyes. This time he really fell asleep. It wasn't because he was tired. It was because he knew that somewhere down there, this story would force many people to reflect on themselves. Not today, not tomorrow, but it will come. And when it comes, he hopes fewer people will have to suffer as they did. There was a very strange moment right after the plane came to a complete stop at the gate. Nobody said anything. No applause. No whispers. No one dared look at anyone for too long. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning system, a steady rhythm like the breathing of a giant beast that had just been tamed. Ethan Carter and Elijah Carter remained standing at the front of the first-class cabin. They didn't sit down. Not yet. It wasn't because of the victory. It was because deep down there was something that still hadn't been let go of, in both of them. Elijah was the first to break the silence. He turned to his brother, his voice low, just loud enough for the two of them to hear. "Are you tired?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the far end of the compartment where the Whitmores had just been led away. The curtain had closed, but the echo lingered. "I'm not tired," Ethan said slowly. "I'm just sad." Elijah nodded slightly. "Sad because even though I was in this position, even though I wore a tailored suit, even though I paid for the best seat on the flight, they still have to prove they deserve to be treated as human beings." In the cockpit, Captain Howard Miller was packing his personal belongings. Every movement of his was slower than usual. He no longer looked like the man who once believed he was the law at 35,000 feet. The captain's hat was placed in the bag. The metal badge was cold. Howard knew. No further explanation is needed. His career, at least with Sky Union Airways, is over. But what weighed most heavily on him wasn't losing his job. But it was the moment he remembered his own words. "On this plane, I decide who belongs." Howard swallowed hard. He used to think it was just a phrase to maintain order, a familiar command. But now it echoed in his mind like an accusation. Outside the aircraft in the jet bridge area, Amelia Brooks, Sky Union's Northeast Regional Managing Director, was present. She was a white woman in her 50s with neatly cut hair and sharp but not cold eyes. Amelia didn't run. She walked quickly, steadily, each step deliberate. The atmosphere changed when she stepped into first class. It's not about power. It's about the presence of someone who truly takes responsibility. Amelia stopped in front of Ethan and Elijah. She didn't hold out her hand right away. She bowed her head. Not deep, not dramatic, but it was enough for everyone to see. "Gentlemen," she said, "I'm Amelia Brooks. I'm here to say this in person, not through a lawyer, not via email." She looked up. What happened today was wrong. There are no ifs. There are no buts. Ethan looked at her, his gaze calm. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "But you also understand that this is not just an apology." Amelia nodded. "I get it." She turned to look at the other passengers in the compartment. "I want everyone to hear me clearly," she said, raising her voice slightly. "Sky Union Airways failed to protect 2 of its passengers from discrimination, and we will take responsibility." No one applauded, but many people sighed. It was as if they had been holding their breath for the past 15 minutes. Elijah spoke, his voice calm, but there was something very real about it. "Mrs. Amelia," he said, "we don't want anyone losing their job just to please us. But we also can't let this pass as an unfortunate incident." Amelia looked directly at Elijah. "I didn't want that either," she replied. "And that's why I'm here not to send a template apology email." A brief silence. Then Amelia continued. "Sky Union will publicly acknowledge its mistakes. No personal blame, no evasive language. And we will invite you both to participate in the process of reviewing our staff training program on unconscious bias." Ethan raised his eyebrows slightly. "Not as a victim," he said, "but as partners," Amelia replied immediately. "Equals." This time Elijah turned to look at his brother. Those eyes said a lot. This is no longer a story about a flight. This is a story about who has the right to define the standard. In seat 3A, a middle-aged man was speaking softly to his wife. "You see, they didn't need to shout. Just stand still and know who you are." In another corner of JFK Airport in the VIP lounge, Victoria Whitmore sat stiffly. The phone in her hand vibrated incessantly. Text messages, missed calls, notifications. Her name has appeared online. Not as a high society lady, but as a symbol of a kind of America that many people are tired of, she mumbled. It's just a seat. But deep down, Victoria understood. It's not about the seating arrangement. It's about the privileged habits that are never questioned. Back on the plane, the reserve crew was ready. The new captain, Daniel Reyes, stepped out of the cockpit. He was younger, he was quiet, and before doing anything, he walked over to Ethan and Elijah. "Gentlemen," Daniel said, "thank you both for your patience. We won't take off until you two are ready." Elijah smiled slightly. "We're ready." The two brothers sat down in seats, 1A and 1B. Ethan leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. The image of their father flashed through his mind. A black man once had to stand the entire length of a bus ride in 1989, even though he had a ticket. If he were still alive, what would he say? He might say, "You don't need to fight for your dignity. Just never let anyone take it away from you." Elijah looked out the window. The New York sky was a pale gray, but in the distance there was a very thin streak of light where the sun was trying to pierce through the clouds. He spoke softly as if talking to himself. "At least, today we weren't silent." The plane began to taxi. Quiet, unhurried, just another flight. But for many of those on board, it will be a flight they will remember for a long time. It wasn't because of the class of seat. It was because they had seen what happens when composure is used in the right way. And somewhere in that quiet first-class cabin, a silent question was sown in the heart. If it had been me that day, would I have been calm enough to stand still? There are moments in life when, having reached a peak, one no longer wants to win. They just want to be right. After the plane doors closed, after the backup crew was ready, after the last whispers in first class had died down, Ethan Carter and Elijah Carter sat down. Not with the airs of victors, but as two men who had gone too far in their emotional journey. Ethan fastened his seatbelt. A dry, sharp click echoed, small but decisive. Elijah leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to breathe. The plane hadn't yet taken off. The engines were only humming like an unfulfilled promise. Inside the cabin, the flight attendants moved more gently and cautiously than necessary. No one dared speak loudly. No one dared look directly at the two brothers for too long. The atmosphere was no longer tense. It was a weighty silence. Ethan opened his eyes and looked out the window. Outside, the pale yellow lights of the JFK runway stretched like streaks of light across the ground. He thought of something very old. 18 years ago, also in New York, he and Elijah stood outside an office building. They were wearing cheap suits and shoes bought at a discount store. The security guard stopped them and asked, "Delivery or cleaning?" That day they said nothing. They turned away. They remembered. Elijah gently opened his eyes as if reading his brother's thoughts. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, just loud enough for the two of them to hear. Ethan nodded. "It's fine. It's just, I'm not happy." Elijah smiled slightly. "Me too." They said nothing more. Words were unnecessary between them. What had just happened wasn't a victory. It was a natural reaction of pride. A flight attendant approached, carrying 2 glasses of water. No wine, no champagne. "Mr. Carter, if you need anything." She paused for a moment as if afraid of saying the wrong word. "Please just tell us." Ethan accepted the glass of water. "Thank you. That's enough." His voice wasn't cold, not sarcastic, just tired. The flight attendant bowed her head and retreated as quickly as a shadow. The plane began to taxi. A faint metallic rattling sound echoed across the floor through the seats through his chest. As the front wheels lifted off the ground, Elijah's eyes opened completely. In that moment, he didn't think about the woman who had been asked to disembark. He didn't think about the dismissed captain. He didn't think about power. He thought about responsibility. Elijah turned to Ethan. "Do you think we went too far?" The question hangs in the air. There's no self-reproach involved. It's simply a moral test. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked straight ahead where the cabin lights reflected off the curved walls of the aircraft's interior. "No," he said slowly. "Going too far is when you stay silent. But today we only said no at the right time." Elijah sighed as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "I understand." The plane ascended. New York shrank below like a folded map of memory. Inside the cabin, some passengers had fallen asleep. A few others still glanced furtively at the front seats. They don't look out of admiration. They look because they are reminded of something. That power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply the ability not to bow down. An hour later, the cabin lights dimmed. Time shifted to a different rhythm. Ethan took out his phone. Dozens of text messages, missed calls, emails from the board, from partners, from the media. He didn't open it. Elijah glanced over. "Aren't you going to watch?" "Not now," Ethan replied. "This story shouldn't be told by us." Elijah nodded. He understood. When those involved talk too much, the truth erodes. Silence sometimes is the way to keep the story in its proper form. The plane stabilized at cruising altitude. Outside the window, the night sky was a deep, dark lake dotted with stars. Ethan closed his eyes. The images of conflict were gone from his mind. Only the voice of their mother from years ago when the two brothers were young remained. "No one can take away your worth unless you allow it." Elijah closed his eyes, too. He recalled the first time they signed a major contract. Their partner had said half jokingly, half seriously, "You guys are different from what I imagined." That day, Elijah replied, "The question is, what were you imagining?" The plane glided through the night. Elsewhere on the ground, the consequences are quietly unfolding. But in this cabin between two first-class seats, there are only two people, not icons, not CEOs, not a media story. It's just that the two brothers have learned a very old, very simple, and very difficult lesson. Maintain your dignity even when no one asks you to. Another flight attendant walked by and gently placed a blanket on the table. Elijah opened his eyes and smiled in thanks. She responded with a small nod, more genuine than any of the previous professional smiles. The night continued to pass. And in that silence, something important happened. No noise, no cameras, no hashtags. The two black men were allowed to sit peacefully in their seats. Not because of who they are, but because they deserve it. The plane gradually descended. The cabin lights dimmed, leaving only the steady hum of the engines and the gentle metallic rattling as the fuselage pierced through the thin layers of clouds. London appeared below, shimmering like a living map, its winding streets bathed in the soft yellow light of the early morning. Marcus Reed opened his eyes first. He wasn't sleeping soundly. Never had he slept soundly after anything like this. He glanced at Malcolm. His twin brother was leaning his head against the chair, eyes closed, breathing evenly, but Marcus knew his brother wasn't really asleep either. They were alike in that respect. On the outside, they appeared calm, but inside they were a whole ocean of thoughts. Marcus breathed slowly. Everything had ended in a superficial sense. They were here, on that flight, in the exact seats they had bought with a new crew, a completely different atmosphere. But deep down, the story wasn't over yet. It wasn't because of anger. It was because of memories. Marcus recalled an evening long ago in Detroit, when he was 12 years old. His father, an electrician, came home late, his clothes still smelling of construction dust. He set down his toolbox, looked at his two sons, and said very slowly, "You must learn to stand still when you are insulted. Not because you are weak, but because if you stand firm, they will reveal who they are." Back then, Marcus didn't understand. Today, he understands it completely. "What are you thinking about?" Malcolm opened his eyes, his voice low and soft enough that no one else could hear. Marcus smiled slightly. "I think, finally, I don't have to explain who I am anymore." Malcolm was silent for a few seconds. "But the price is still there," Marcus nodded. "Right. The price wasn't in the money, or the contract, or the shares. The price was that each time this happened, they had to reopen an old door in their hearts. A door leading back to days of being viewed with suspicion, to being asked questions that others would never have to answer. "Do you ever get tired?" Malcolm asked. "Yes," Marcus replied truthfully. "But I don't want to get tired unnecessarily." The loudspeaker blared and the new captain announced they were preparing to land. His voice was calm and respectful. No unnecessary authority, no commands, just information. A small detail, but Marcus noticed it. As the plane's wheels touched down on the runway, the passenger cabin vibrated slightly. Some people applauded, some breathed a sigh of relief. Marcus and Malcolm, however, remained seated, as if the truly significant moment had happened long before. At the exit, a new flight attendant bowed to them. "Have a good day, Mr. Reed." The tone was sincere, unforced, not specialized, just ordinary respect. Marcus responded with a nod. He didn't need an apology anymore. He needed change. Outside, the London air was cold and damp. The smell of coffee from the small counter near the gate mingled with the metallic scent of the international airport. Life was hectic, emotionless, but fair in its own way. Here, no one knew what they had just been through. And that, strangely enough, was easy to breathe. Malcolm's phone rang. A short text message from Evelyn Carter, a longtime lawyer at Reed and Stone. The media has started asking, "Do we want to issue a statement?" Malcolm showed the screen to Marcus. Marcus pondered. Hundreds of possibilities flashed through his mind. A strong statement, a press conference, a long, incisive article that could cost someone else their job. They had enough evidence, enough influence, enough leverage. But then, he remembered the face of the young pilot in the cockpit that day, the uneasy look in his eyes. He remembered the silent husband walking behind that white woman, head bowed like a shadow. He remembered Tiffany, not as a villain but as someone who had chosen the easiest path and had to pay the price. "We don't need to crush anyone else," Marcus said slowly. "So what do you want?" Malcolm asked. "I want them to look at the system, not at us." Malcolm understood immediately. That was the approach his brother had always chosen. Not targeting individuals, targeting the structure. How should we respond to Evelyn? Tell her to draft a short statement. No attacks, no fanfare. Just say the matter has been handled and we expect the airline industry to do better. Malcolm typed quickly. Done. They walked out of the airport. A black car was waiting. The driver opened the door, said little, and just nodded. On the way back to the hotel, London flashed past the window. Old buildings mingled with modern ones. People hurried along, each carrying their own story. Marcus observed it all with a pensive gaze. He thought of his mother, the woman who had wiped his hands before his first day at business school and said, "You don't need to prove you're better than anyone. You just need to live right." Did Marcus live the right life? He wasn't sure, but he knew he hadn't bowed his head. That evening in the quiet hotel room, Marcus sat alone. Malcolm was out meeting with a business partner. The soft yellow light shone. A glass of water sat on the table. No alcohol, no celebration. Marcus opened his computer. He wasn't writing for the press. He was writing for himself. A personal memo, something he always did after every major event. "What hurts me most isn't being insulted. It's knowing that this isn't uncommon and that others will experience it if the system doesn't change." He paused, typed another line. "True power doesn't lie in making someone disappear. It lies in forcing them to look back." Marcus stopped filming. Outside, a gentle London rain began to fall. Small, steady drops, quiet and unobtrusive, like a slow cleansing. The next day, the headlines appeared. Not as sensational as many had expected, but clear enough. No Marcus or Malcolm names in bold. Just questions about corporate culture, about training, about invisible power. And for Marcus, that was enough. Late that evening, Malcolm returned. The two brothers sat opposite each other, not saying much. Just their familiar presence. "Do you regret not going further?" Malcolm asked. Marcus shook his head. "No, I think. Sometimes winning is knowing when to stop." Malcolm smiled slightly. Dad would be proud. Marcus didn't answer. He just looked out the window where the city lights reflected on the glass blurred by the rain. A rare stillness settled within him. Not because everything was perfect, but because he knew he had chosen a path that 12-year-old Marcus wouldn't be ashamed of. To the world, this story might just be an incident. For Marcus Reed, it's a reminder. Dignity is not something that is given. It is something we carry with us, and no one has the right to take it away unless we allow it. In the next part, the story will no longer be about the airplane. It will delve into the more subtle consequences, unobtrusive changes, different people at different airports. And the most important question remains. If you were in that situation, would you stand still or would you bow your head? If you've followed this story this far, please take a second to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who has experienced similar injustice. Not to fuel anger, but to remind each other that calmness is more powerful than any shouting. The Boeing 787 taxied slowly down the runway. There was no more chaos, no more shouting, no more scrutinizing stares. All that remained was the steady low hum of the engine, like the breathing of someone who had just emerged from a storm. Marcus Reed leaned back in seat 1A. The first-class cabin lights were dimmed. Beside him, Malcolm Reed's eyes were closed, but he wasn't asleep. The two brothers said nothing. There was no need to say anything. They said enough, with their silence. A new flight attendant approached. She was young, with brown hair, her voice slightly shaky, but her eyes were very sincere. "Mr. Reed, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, not on anyone's behalf, on my own behalf, because I thought things like this wouldn't happen again." Marcus opened his eyes. He smiled. Not a triumphant smile, but the smile of someone who understood very well how complicated this world was. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "Just remember, when you have a choice, choose the right one." The flight attendant nodded. Tears welled up in her eyes. Then she quietly left. Malcolm let out a soft sigh. "Are you tired?" he asked. Marcus thought for a few seconds. "Yes," he said truthfully. "Not tired because of what happened on the plane, but tired because I've become too used to being strong." Malcolm opened his eyes. He looked up at the ceiling of the airplane cabin. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that if I became successful enough, if I dressed well enough, if I spoke properly enough, then these things would disappear." Marcus shook his head very slightly. "No," he said. "It didn't disappear. It just changed shape." A moment of silence. "But today," Malcolm continued, "I realized something different. What we don't need to prove we belong there," Malcolm said. "We already belong." Marcus closed his eyes. This time he was truly resting. At the same time, in a very different place, Evelyn Carter sat in the airport waiting area, her fur coat draped over her lap, holding her phone but not scrolling through it. The news spread, not as loudly as social media had hoped, but enough for those who know the situation to understand it very well. An email appeared on the screen. It was from the board of directors of a charity where she had once served as honorary chair. Brief, polite, cold. "We are temporarily suspending her from all her roles until further assessment is completed." Evelyn finished reading. She wasn't angry. She didn't yell. There was only a feeling of emptiness. For the first time in her life, she couldn't use her position to speak. She looked up. Through the large window of the airport, a plane had just taken off. She didn't know, but it was Marcus and Malcolm Reed's flight. In the sky, the morning sunlight streamed through the window. Marcus opened his eyes. He took out his phone. Not for reading comments, not for watching viral videos. He opened an old photograph. Two black boys about 10 years old standing in front of a small house. Their clothes were mismatched, but their eyes shone brightly. "Do you remember," Malcolm said, "the first time we flew on an airplane?" Marcus chuckled softly. "I remember. Economy class. Middle seat. Air conditioning broken, and the man next to us kept gripping the handrail." Malcolm laughed as if we were a threat. Marcus was silent for a second. "I remember then," he said, "I promised myself that if I ever had power, I wouldn't use it to scare anyone." Malcolm turned to look at him, and he kept his word. The plane stabilized at cruising altitude. A soft announcement was made. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached cruising altitude." Marcus took a deep breath, exhaled. This isn't the sigh of relief of a victor. It's the sigh of relief of someone who has stood firm. This story isn't about a flight attendant being fired. It's not about a passenger being humiliated. It's not about a call to power. It's a story about choices. Choose not to react with anger. Choose not to bow down in fear. Choose to maintain your dignity, even when others try to take it away from you. You might be listening to this story and thinking, "I'm not the CEO. I didn't receive a call like that. I don't have the authority." But remember this. Marcus and Malcolm Reed didn't win because they were rich. They didn't win because they had shares. They won a long time ago. They won from the moment they didn't lose themselves. When you are looked down upon, when you are underestimated, when someone says or thinks, "You don't belong here," you always have a choice. You can yell, you can argue, or you can stand still and let the truth speak for itself. Justice doesn't always come immediately, but when it does, it comes very clearly. The plane continued flying forward. It carried no resentment, only a quiet lesson that this world still has injustice, but there is still room for kindness, and for people strong enough not to become cruel. If you feel this story resonates with you, please leave a comment. It doesn't have to be long, just be genuine. And if you want to hear more stories about people, dignity, and the silent power, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We will meet again, in other stories, on other flights, and in moments when silence speaks volumes.